Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the unfamiliar clothing laid out on the bed. Preston stood before the mirror, his heart racing as he took in his reflection. The long blonde wig cascaded over his shoulders, framing a face now softened by carefully applied makeup. He smoothed down the floral sundress, feeling the unfamiliar fabric against his skin. "You look beautiful, honey," Esther said, appearing in the doorway with a proud smile. "Are you ready for your first day as Freya?" Preston, now Freya, took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." Esther crossed the room and placed her hands on Freya's shoulders, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Remember, this isn't just about looking the part. It's about experiencing life from a different perspective. Pay attention to how people treat you, how you feel in different situations." Freya nodded, trying to quell the butterflies in her stomach. "I know, Mom. That's why I'm doing this, right? For the project." "Exactly. Now let's go over a few last-minute tips before you head out." For the next few minutes, Esther coached Freya on feminine mannerisms, how to sit, walk, and gesture in a more ladylike manner. It felt awkward and unnatural, but Freya did her best to absorb the information. "Remember, smaller steps when you walk," Esther demonstrated, "and try to keep your knees together when you sit." Freya attempted to mimic her mother's movements, feeling clumsy and self-conscious. "This is harder than I thought it would be." "It'll get easier with practice," Esther assured her. "The key is to be aware of your body and how you're presenting yourself." As they made their way downstairs, Freya's nerves intensified. The reality of what she was about to do hit her full force. For the next week, she would be living as a girl, attending school and interacting with her peers as Freya instead of Preston. "What if someone recognizes me?" Freya asked, voicing one of her biggest fears. Esther squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We've gone over this, honey. Your classmates know about the experiment, and the teachers have been informed. Anyone who might recognize you outside of school has been told you're my niece visiting for the week." Freya nodded, trying to draw strength from her mother's confidence. As they approached the front door, Esther handed her a purse. "Don't forget this. And remember, if you need anything or feel uncomfortable, you can always call me." With a final hug and words of encouragement, Freya stepped out into the world, feeling like she was stepping onto a stage to perform a role she hadn't fully rehearsed. The walk to the bus stop was an exercise in self-consciousness. Freya felt like every passerby was staring, judging, seeing through her disguise. She focused on her mother's advice, taking smaller steps and trying to move with a more fluid grace. Boarding the bus brought a new set of challenges. As Freya made her way down the aisle, she felt the weight of curious glances. Finding an empty seat, she sat down, remembering at the last second to keep her knees together. An elderly woman across the aisle smiled warmly at her. "What a lovely dress, dear. You look charming." Freya mumbled a thank you, her voice higher than usual. The compliment, while kind, only served to heighten her awareness of her appearance and the role she was playing. As the bus neared the school, Freya's anxiety peaked. This was it, the real test. How would her classmates react? Would she be able to maintain the illusion throughout the day? Stepping off the bus, Freya took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She could do this. It was just an experiment after all. A week of living as a girl to gain insight into gender dynamics. The school hallways were a cacophony of noise and activity. Freya navigated through the crowds, hyper-aware of every brush against her bare arms, every curious glance thrown her way. She made her way to her locker, fumbling with the combination as she tried to ignore the whispers and stares around her. "Hey, Freya!" a familiar voice called out. Turning, she saw her best friend, Jorge, approaching with a grin. Wow, you really went all out, didn't you? Freya managed a small smile. Yeah, well, if I'm going to do this, I figured I might as well commit fully. Jorge looked her up and down, shaking his head in amazement. I gotta say, it's pretty convincing. If I didn't know it was you, I'd never guess. His words were meant as a compliment, but they stirred a strange mix of emotions in Freya. Pride at pulling off the transformation, but also a twinge of discomfort at how easily her male identity could be erased. Thanks, I think, Freya replied, closing her locker. How weird is this going to be? Jorge shrugged. Probably pretty weird at first, but hey, that's the point of the experiment, right? To see how differently people treat you? As they walked to class, Freya couldn't help but notice the change in how other students reacted to her presence. Guys who had never given Preston a second glance were suddenly smiling and trying to catch her eye. A group of girls she barely knew waved and called out compliments on her outfit. It was a jarring experience, this sudden visibility. Freya found herself torn between basking in the attention and shrinking from it. Their first class of the day was English, and as Freya took her seat, she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. The teacher, Mrs. Anderson, cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. As you all know, we have a unique situation this week, she began. Preston has volunteered to participate in a sociology experiment, living as a female student named Freya. I expect everyone to treat this seriously and respectfully. There were a few snickers and whispers, but overall, the class seemed more curious than mocking. Freya sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. As Mrs. Anderson began the lesson, Freya tried to focus on the material, but found her attention constantly pulled to the small details of her new reality. The way her hair brushed against her neck, the feel of the dress against her legs, the weight of the unfamiliar underwear beneath. When Mrs. Anderson called on her to answer a question, Freya's voice came out as a nervous squeak. She cleared her throat and tried again, consciously pitching her voice higher. The theme of identity is explored through the protagonist's struggle with societal expectations, she managed to say, relieved when Mrs. Anderson nodded approvingly. As the class progressed, Freya began to relax slightly. The initial shock of her appearance seemed to be wearing off, and her classmates were settling into a semblance of normalcy. But then came the moment she'd been dreading: group work. Mrs. Anderson divided the class into small groups to discuss the assigned reading. Freya found herself seated with two girls she knew casually and a boy named Michael, who had always been friendly but distant with Preston. So, Freya, one of the girls, Emma, began with a sly smile. How's it feel to be one of us? Freya felt her cheeks flush. It's different. Kind of overwhelming, actually. The other girl, Lily, nodded sympathetically. I bet. But hey, at least you get to experience the fun parts of being a girl, like fashion and makeup, without dealing with the not-so-fun stuff. Michael leaned in, his expression curious. Yeah, like, what kind of not-so-fun stuff? Emma rolled her eyes. Oh, you know, the usual. Cramps, catcalling, constantly worrying about our safety. Freya listened intently, struck by the casual way they discussed issues she'd never had to consider before. It was eye-opening, to say the least. Speaking of safety, Lily added, lowering her voice, you should be careful walking home alone, Freya. There's been some creep hanging around the park lately. The warning sent a chill down Freya's spine. It was one thing to intellectually understand the concerns women faced, but to suddenly be on the receiving end of such advice was sobering. As the group discussion continued, Freya found herself becoming more comfortable. The girls seemed to have accepted her into their circle, sharing gossip and inside jokes. Michael, too, was paying more attention to her than he ever had to Preston. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Freya gathered her things, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation for what the rest of the day would bring. In the hallway, she navigated the crowds with growing confidence, but still felt a jolt of surprise when a group of senior boys called out to her. "Hey, new girl! Want us to show you around?" Freya quickened her pace, heart pounding. She'd never felt so simultaneously flattered and uncomfortable. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of new experiences and shifting perspectives. In math class, Freya noticed how the teacher seemed to call on the male students more often, even when her hand was raised. During PE, she felt exposed and vulnerable in the required shorts and t-shirt, acutely aware of the gazes that followed her as she jogged around the track. By lunchtime, Freya was emotionally exhausted. She sat with her usual group of friends, who were full of questions about her experience so far. "Have you been in the girls' bathroom yet?" one of them asked, grinning mischievously. Freya shook her head. "No, I've been avoiding it. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of immersion." Her friends laughed, but Freya could sense an underlying current of curiosity and perhaps even envy. It occurred to her that many of them might wonder what it would be like to experience life from the opposite gender's perspective. As they ate, Freya found herself paying more attention to the dynamics of the cafeteria. She noticed how groups of girls huddled together, whispering and giggling, while boys tended to be louder and more physically expressive. It was like seeing a familiar scene with new eyes. After lunch, Freya had her sociology class, the very class for which she was conducting this experiment. As she entered the room, her teacher, Mr. Ramirez, gave her an encouraging nod. "All right, class," he began, once everyone was seated. "As you can see, we have a unique opportunity this week to discuss gender roles and societal expectations in real time. Freya, would you like to share some initial observations from your experience so far?" Freya felt all eyes turn to her. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, surprised by how much she already had to say. "It's been eye-opening," she started. "I've noticed things I never paid attention to before, like how differently people treat me, both positively and negatively. I've been complimented more in one morning than I usually am in a week, but I've also felt more vulnerable and self-conscious." As she continued to share her observations, Freya could see her classmates listening intently. Some nodded in recognition, while others looked surprised or thoughtful. "One thing that really struck me," Freya added, "is how much mental energy goes into presenting as female. There are so many unspoken rules and expectations that I never realized existed." Mr. Ramirez nodded approvingly. "Excellent observations, Freya."
Class, what are your thoughts on this? How do you think our society's gender expectations shape our daily experiences? The discussion that followed was lively and engaging. Freya found herself learning as much from her classmates' perspectives as they seemed to be learning from her experience. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Freya felt a mix of relief and anticipation. She'd survived her first day as a girl, but there were still 6 more to go. Walking home, Freya was acutely aware of her surroundings in a way she'd never been before. She found herself checking over her shoulder more often, especially as she passed the park Lily had warned her about earlier. When she finally reached her house, Freya let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Stepping inside, she kicked off the uncomfortable shoes and called out, "Mom, I'm home!" Esther appeared from the kitchen, eyes eager. "How was it? Tell me everything!" Freya sank onto the couch, suddenly overwhelmed by the emotions of the day. "It was intense. I don't even know where to start." As Freya recounted her experiences, Esther listened attentively, offering insights and asking thoughtful questions.
It struck Freya how this experiment was bringing them closer, opening up conversations they'd never had before. "You know," Esther said softly, "watching you go through this is making me reflect on my own experiences as a woman. There are so many things we just accept as normal, but seeing it through your eyes, it's eye-opening for me too." Freya nodded, feeling a new appreciation for her mother and the challenges she must have faced throughout her life. As evening settled in, Freya found herself struggling with an unexpected dilemma: her homework. She'd never realized how much of her study routine was tied to her physical comfort. Sitting at her desk in a dress with unfamiliar undergarments and long hair that kept falling in her face was a strange and distracting experience. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pushing back from the desk in frustration. "How am I supposed to focus like this?" Esther poked her head into the room. "Everything okay, honey?" Freya sighed, gesturing at her textbooks. "I can't concentrate. It's like my brain is so focused on how I look and feel that there's no room left for algebra." Her mother smiled sympathetically. "Why don't you try changing into something more comfortable? The experiment doesn't mean you have to be uncomfortable in your own home." The suggestion was a relief. Freya rifled through her closet, settling on a pair of soft pajama pants and a loose t-shirt. As she changed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Even in casual clothes, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, there was something undeniably feminine about her appearance. Settling back at her desk, Freya found it easier to focus on her studies, but her mind kept drifting back to the events of the day, analyzing every interaction, every new experience. Later that night, as Freya lay in bed, sleep eluded her. The weight of the day's experiences pressed on her mind, demanding to be processed. She found herself wondering how much of her identity was tied to her gender, and how much was simply her. The next morning brought new challenges. Freya woke to the unfamiliar sensation of long hair tangled around her face. As she stumbled to the bathroom, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and did a double take. For a moment, she'd forgotten about the experiment, and the reflection staring back at her was a shock. Preparing for school took longer than usual. Freya fumbled with makeup, trying to recreate the natural look her mother had shown her. She settled on a simple outfit, jeans and a flowy top, hoping to blend in more than she had the day before. At breakfast, Esther studied her daughter's face. "How are you feeling about day 2? Freya poked at her cereal, considering the question. "Nervous, I guess, but also curious. Yesterday was so intense, but I feel like I learned a lot. I'm kind of interested to see what today brings." Esther nodded approvingly. "That's a great attitude to have. Remember, the goal isn't just to experience being a girl, but to really observe and analyze how people treat you differently." As Freya walked to the bus stop, she found herself more aware of her surroundings than ever before. She noticed things she'd never paid attention to: the way other women walked, how they interacted with each other, the subtle adjustments they made to their clothing or hair as they passed reflective surfaces. On the bus, Freya ended up sitting next to a girl from her grade named Zoe. They'd never been close, but Zoe smiled warmly at her. "How's the experiment going?" Zoe asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Freya shrugged, still not entirely comfortable discussing it. "It's educational. Kind of overwhelming, to be honest." Zoe nodded sympathetically. "I can't even imagine. But hey, if you need any advice or just want to talk, I'm here. Us girls have to stick together, right?" The casual inclusion in the category of girls sent a strange thrill through Freya. It was both flattering and disorienting. As they chatted, Freya found herself relaxing. Zoe shared stories about her own experiences navigating high school as a girl, offering insights Freya had never considered before. The worst is when guys think they're being nice by explaining things to you that you already know, Zoe said, rolling her eyes. Like, dude, I don't need you to break down the plot of Star Wars for me. I've seen it too. Freya laughed, but filed the information away. She'd been guilty of that kind of behavior before. She realized with a twinge of embarrassment. At school, Freya noticed a shift in how her classmates treated her. The novelty of her transformation seemed to have worn off, and she was being treated more like just another girl in the class. It was both a relief and slightly disappointing. In history class, Freya experienced firsthand what Zoe had mentioned on the bus. As the teacher discussed World War II, a boy named Ryan leaned over to her. "Do you know what D-Day was?" he asked in a low voice, clearly trying to be helpful. Freya blinked at him, caught off guard. Yes? Of course I do." Ryan looked surprised, then a bit embarrassed. "Oh, right. Sorry, I just thought... Never mind." The interaction left Freya feeling a mix of annoyance and fascination. Was this what girls dealt with regularly? People assuming they were less knowledgeable or capable? During lunch, Freya decided to push herself out of her comfort zone. Instead of sitting with her usual group of friends, she joined a table of girls she knew casually from various classes. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, trying to project confidence she didn't quite feel. The girls welcomed her warmly, quickly drawing her into their conversation. Freya found herself swept up in a world of inside jokes, shared complaints about teachers and classes, and discussions about everything from music to relationships. "So, Freya," one of the girls, Megan, said with a mischievous grin. "Now that you're one of us, spill. Any guys catching your eye?" Freya nearly choked on her water. "What? No, I haven't really thought about that." The girls laughed, not unkindly. "Come on, there must be someone you think is cute. What about Michael from English class? He's been totally checking you out." The conversation spun into a discussion of various boys' merits and flaws, with Freya listening in fascinated silence. It was strange to hear her male classmates discussed this way, as objects of attraction and speculation. As the day wore on, Freya found herself growing more comfortable in her role. She caught herself automatically smoothing her hair or adjusting her clothes, gestures she'd seen other girls make countless times, but had never understood the impulse behind. In PE, Freya faced a new challenge, changing in the girls' locker room. She'd been avoiding it, using the nurse's office instead, but today, the teacher insisted everyone change together for a group activity. Heart-pounding, Freya entered the locker room. The cacophony of voices and the sight of girls in various states of undress was overwhelming. She found a quiet corner and changed as quickly as possible, trying not to look around too much. "Hey, Freya?" a voice called out. It was Emma from her English class. "Cute bra, where'd you get it?" Freya felt her face flame red. "Oh, my mom bought it for me," she mumbled, quickly pulling her shirt on. Emma nodded approvingly. "Well, it looks great. You should totally come shopping with us this weekend. We're hitting up the mall for some retail therapy." The invitation, casual as it was, made Freya's head spin. She was being included in girl activities, treated as one of them. It was both exciting and terrifying. "Maybe," Freya hedged, not sure how to respond. "I'll have to check with my mom." As they filed out onto the field for class, Freya found herself hyper-aware of her body in a way she never had been before. The way her chest bounced slightly as she jogged, the feel of her hair swishing against her back, the way her clothes clung to her in the humid air. It was all new and slightly uncomfortable. The PE teacher divided them into teams for a game of soccer. Freya, who had always been athletic as Preston, found herself hesitating. Should she play as aggressively as she usually did? Would it be weird if she outperformed the other girls? As the game progressed, Freya realized her concerns were unfounded. Many of the girls were just as competitive and skilled as the boys. She threw herself into the game, relishing the physical activity as a break from the mental gymnastics of the past day and a half. After class, as they walked back to the locker rooms, one of Freya's teammates, a girl named Alicia, fell into step beside her. "Nice moves out there," Alicia said, grinning. "You play soccer regularly?" Freya nodded, then caught herself. I used to, before, you know." Alicia's eyes widened in understanding. "Oh, right, the experiment thing. That must be so weird. But hey, you should join the girls' soccer team next season. We could use someone with your skills." The compliment and invitation warmed Freya. She'd never considered that her athletic abilities might be just as valued in a female context. As the school day came to an end, Freya found herself both exhausted and exhilarated. Each interaction, each new experience, was adding to her understanding of what it meant to navigate the world as a girl.
Thanks for watching my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!